Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and I'm so pleased to be here. I'm honored to be here at the European Summer University for Digital Humanities, and thank you all for coming out on a beautiful sunny summer's day to talk about collaboration. So I'm going to take about an hour, as I was instructed to do, and hopefully leave time for some good discussion afterwards. In the spirit of the European Summer University, I'm going to use bilingual slides. Somewhat privileging the French over the English that you will hear, and I do apologize for any errors. My French is far from perfect. I did have somebody check it over, but not absolutely everything. If I'm talking too fast or too quietly, please just wave to indicate that you can't hear. Okay, I'll speak up more. And I speak also from within a North American context, obviously. So I'm really looking forward to hearing how collaboration plays out here in the European Union. Certainly my perception is that you collaborate a lot more, are perhaps forced to collaborate a lot more through the funding structures that you have here than we tend to do in North America. So I'm really looking forward to that discussion. It's always good to be reminded of difference. This talk took shape out of the requirement to provide an abstract in another language than English. And that got me thinking about the slippage from spectrum to spectre. So collaboration in many respects challenges the traditional methods of the humanities and takes researchers beyond our comfort zones. It brings to the fore the ethics, politics, and other complications of shared labor, the various and sometimes competing aims that motivate people to work together, and the risks and benefits of working in groups. I want here to contend that digital methods deepen and extend and enrich the collaboration already embedded in scholarly practices, even when that work is solitary, but also unsettles it. Collaboration in many respects challenges the traditional methods of the humanities and takes researchers beyond our comfort zones. So here's a little roadmap of where I'm going. Through traditional humanities methods, then how the digital enhances the humanities forms of collaboration, then talking about the specter of collaboration before talking about where we might go with a recognition of this challenge posed by collaboration. So the digital humanities is a field that prides itself on its collaborative practices. My own perspective here emerges from more than 20 years of collaborative work in digital humanities. I got involved in digital humanities through a collaborative project, the Orlando Project. And this is just a little overview of it. It is more than 20 years old now. It is a born digital history of women's writing in the British Isles from the beginnings to the present. It was the collaborative work of, when it published in 2006, more than 100 people, now more than 140 people, have worked on the project, producing together entries, bibliographical and contextual information on women writers and the conditions in which they lived and worked. It was started in SGML, for those of you who are old enough to remember SGML, migrated to XML. It is a deeply tagged, extensively tagged data set that has more than 8 million tags in it. So it was very collaborative. This is the kind of text that underlies the text that you read. It helps you as a user to search it, to sort it, to slice it, to dice it, to get at what you want. And all these tags were produced by the project itself. They're custom tagged, not TEI, although we based the tag set on the TEI. So that's the environment within which I started to do digital humanities. There is no single entry within Orlando that has been produced by just one person. They are all produced by a team. And that led me to QWRC, which is how we pronounce CWRC, which is the acronym for the Canadian Writing Research Collaboratory. It is a platform for collaboration for shared virtual labor and a kind of online research environment. It emerged from the experience of doing Orlando and wanting to make that experience available for other people, so to generalize it and to extend it to different kinds of collaborative work in the digital humanities. QWRC is just about finished now. We're going to be launching it in the fall at a conference in Edmonton, which is where the University of Alberta is. I'm going to talk about a few features of Quirk within this talk, but it very much emerges from my thinking through the process of building this infrastructure, what it means to try to produce an environment for collaboration. So if we think of the humanities and collaboration in the humanities, there is a spectrum. At root, it really is collaborative from the very beginning. As Willard McCarty says, citation is an acknowledgement that we are always in conversation with others. We are always building on the works of others. There's co-editing as well. That takes perhaps into a deeper form of collaboration in that we're working more directly with the people that we are co-editing with, sometimes at a distance, sometimes in person. The Browning's Correspondence Project comes out of my own field of study, a huge long project still ongoing, now migrated to digital, involving a series of editors succeeding each other. There is co-authorship, and these are two relatively extreme forms of it. J.K. Gibson Graham is actually two people writing contemporary political economy, and Michael Field was two people in the 19th century who wrote poetry together. Not all collaborative relationships involve adopting a common pseudonym, but as we know, collaboration of that sort is fairly common in the humanities. And then there's team projects, such as the very famous Oxford English Dictionary project, which took almost 2/3 of a century, or 3/4 almost, to produce itself, and really invented new forms of information management in the process of getting produced, because it was so complicated to try to produce a historical dictionary of English. It was also an early example of citizen scholarship engagement, because they had people write in examples of words that they thought might not have been discovered yet in early sources. So they were actually taking contributions from the public and incorporating them into this resource. And this is a much more recent collaborative project that was produced in Canada and ended up producing a database. Even though it was published in print, it also sort of pushed on the information practices of the scholars involved, pushed them to find new ways of sharing and mobilizing the information that they were gathering, because they were working in a team and needed to figure out new ways of communicating and making that data available. So we can see within this spectrum, within the humanities, a kind of tendency towards scaling up and towards sharing. And certainly within the digital humanities, collaboration that involves scaling up and sharing is very common. There are many, many definitions of what digital humanities is or are. I'm not going to go into them now, but you will find collaboration in most of them. It seems to be one of the defining features of digital humanities as far as many people are concerned. So collaboration is there in the digital humanities. It's there from the very beginning. This is our sort of foundational narrative of where the digital humanities begins in Father Buza's Index Thomisticus. And those are the punch card operators who produced the data for that project. And Melissa Terrace has, I think, done some excellent recovery work to sort of allow us to see that even the singular founding father had a team behind him. And that team was diverse. It wasn't just Jesuits, it wasn't just men, it was men and women. So we have the same kind of spectrum in the digital humanities as we do in the pre-digital, but we see a kind of scaling up. So citation, I think hyperlinking, embedding sources, and all of the practices around archiving data now have, become key to our field, and I think will become more common as the field continues to mature. Co-editing, we have not only large editing projects that are as ambitious or more ambitious than anything that was done in print culture, but we have organizational initiatives like the Text Encoding Initiative that is working to standardize how editing is done digitally, and we also create platforms for editing as well. Co-authorship has kind of exploded in a whole range of contexts. We have now platforms that allow us to work simultaneously in teams, as well as lots of systems for sort of managing collaboration in a writing environment. And of course, team projects are very common in the digital humanities, and there's an understanding that many projects simply could not get done without a group of people, and sometimes the organizational structures that go with that. So we have not only team research projects, but organizations such as the ad hoc constituent organizations, which manage the conference. We have journals, we have all sorts of collaborative structures that sort of hold up the discipline. So there are a number of technical considerations that I'm going to talk about first as we think about this spectrum. First would be metadata and data formats. These are really foundational to enabling collaboration. They allow us to move information about. Some of you will remember when you couldn't get a file between a PC and a Mac very easily, right? That comes down to how data format works. And a lot of our concerns around preservation have to do with things like data and metadata formats. They seem trivial, they seem boring, they are absolutely fundamental to ensuring the longevity of what we do. So Abby Smith-Rumsey rightly says, right at the outset, right at the get-go, you need to be thinking about these things in order to ensure that your scholarship will be accessible to you and to others in the future. I'm going to talk about tools in other contexts for now. I'm just going to talk about the fact that there is a kind of spectrum from open to closed, from prototype to mature. We are, in some contexts, we define ourselves as people who create tools or who engage with tools in a different way than people outside of the digital humanities. Interfaces are a consideration when we're thinking about collaboration, very often I think overlooked. They are, of course, connected to tools, but they're the ways that we interact with tools. They're the graphical means, the haptic means by which we interact with computational systems, and perhaps the single most influential factor in the adoption of software, the point at which the situatedness of both knowledge and researchers comes home to roost. Interfaces, both experimental ones that trouble how information is usually designed for us, and we have Stan Rucker and Alan Gailey's argument that every prototype makes an argument, as well as normalized ones that form part of our daily information infrastructure, all convey arguments about what's important, what matters, what thing is related to another thing, and so on. They construct the meaning of what they present, and they have a massive impact on how we engage with knowledge. So what I'm showing here is an interface for one of the central tools in the Canadian Writing Research Collaboratory. It's called QuirkWriter, and it is a browser-based XML and RDF editor. I'm going to talk more about RDF in a little bit, but I've argued in other contexts that one of the things we need to think about when thinking about how collaborative scholarship works is who our tools are hailing, who are our tools reaching out to and inviting to work. And many of the leading XML editing interfaces really look like programming environments. They don't look like writing environments. They don't look like word processors. So this is an attempt to produce something that works a little bit more like a word processor. And what's happening in this slide is you're seeing how the tool also manages authorities so that people are using the same authorities across different projects, because Quirk doesn't only house the Orlando project, it houses a number of other projects and will increasingly house other projects. And our strategy for collaboration between the projects, if you like, even if they never talk to each other, is that they'll all use the same authorities, they'll all use the same data formats, the same metadata formats, and in that way, the materials that they produce should be interoperable. So this interface tries to hail the reader or user to become not just a consumer of information, but a producer, a contributor, a collaborator. So it behooves us all to think carefully on the interfaces of available tools and platforms beyond their obvious affordances, for they will help to shape the collaborations for which they're used. Coordinating contributors and tracking workflow are two other important technical considerations when we're thinking about collaboration. Defining roles of the people involved in a project so that there's clarity about who does what can simplify what kind of interfaces you're presenting to people, can simplify what kinds of workflows you're expecting them to engage in, and can help to manage the work. So one of the things that Quirk does, if you've edited an XML document, is it immediately asks you to apply a workflow stamp to that object so that it's tracking what you have done. And that means we can produce reports to say, okay, these objects have all been through all of the steps in this workflow, and now they're ready for the next stage. So we're trying to make the process of tracking work of this sort more easy. So coordinating workflow is a major component in collaborative scholarly work, and research quality depends upon it, but many platforms don't have this kind of control. So being able to track what objects go through various stages such as ingestion, metadata creation, derivation or enhancement, transformations, and so on, as they make their way through to peer review possibly or publication becomes really important. Those workflows tend not to be linear. They are often iterative. They loop back on themselves, and certainly in the Orlando project, we revise stuff all the time. New information comes to light, we find mistakes, we're fixing stuff all the time. So Christine Borgman reminds us that digital objects are not fixed and therefore are continually susceptible to revision and update as the state of knowledge changes. So an environment involving numerous collaborators then needs to be able to track that kind of continuous change that is going to be happening to its objects. So we have this kind of technical apparatus to support collaboration. One would just need to make it available to see huge adoption, you think? Right? The affordances for best practices, in some ways, I would say, actually impede collaboration at times. So for instance, with this, as you're working in Quirk, some activities you get prompted like this, other activities just generate the need for a stamp but don't force you to do it right away, and you can pile up a log of stamps that need to be applied to your object. So I would say that probably one of the affordances that's going to be most important in Quirk is the ability to skip those stamps, because they can become, especially if you're working on a lot of materials and doing a lot of work, they can become oppressive in a certain sense. And yet, as I've said, certain kinds of processes rely on this. So that's in some sense a failing of the interface, that it isn't easier to apply workflow stamps, but there's no question that it's always going to take more time to do collaborative work in a range of ways. And so those affordances become sometimes a bit of an impediment, and people just get frustrated at them. And we can see this already in the way that people are using the platform. So people are not, I think, always convinced of the value of this kind of work. They don't even necessarily appreciate the importance of some of the things I've already talked about, like data formats and standardized metadata. These things come home to roost as we are involved in projects for longer and sort of see the challenges of keeping them up and sustaining them, or making the data available to other people, sharing it, trying to be interoperable with other projects. But to the average user, it's very easy to get turned off in some ways by the specter of collaboration. And certainly I think it is one of the sources of resistance, in my experience, to the adoption of digital humanities. People are used to working alone. They are trained to work alone. That's the model of what a humanities scholar does. It's associated with writing on one's own in a nice little cloistered space in a library or in one's study. And we had a really interesting experience early on in the Quirk project when we brought, after the grant was received, we brought together a bunch of very sympathetic people who had supported the idea of the grant and had a panel, and a number of them picked on this phrase from the grant application. They did not like it. And they did not like it because it was kind of bossy, I suppose, the way that it's put. But I think also because it kind of goes to the heart of the differences between traditional scholarly labor and the argument that we were making about where scholarly work was going. Now, it might be easy to set up an opposition between those resistant humanities scholars and the progressive digital humanities researchers, but I don't think that's true either. Within it, I think collaboration is very hard, and what I would point to is the fact that our resources are still very, very siloed. We work in small collaborative groups, but we don't collaborate across projects very well. We don't manage to make our work interoperable, even though we know that's really important. And it is really, really important. This is a study of, a library study of information practices, and it found that the single biggest barrier to using digital resources was that lack of interoperability. Because we have all this stuff, right? We have things from a whole range of sources, in different locations. These are all things to do with the Canadian writer E. Pauline Johnson. They're all in different places. They would make a really nice set of research materials, but you have to go here and here and here and here to get them. You have to engage with that many different interfaces. There's no easy way to pull them all into the same tool, to store them together, or anything like that. So we need to think about how to link our materials together. I'm going to talk for a few minutes now about link to open data as one of the directions that we could go that I see real possibilities for collaboration. And then I'm going to get back to the whole question of the challenges of collaboration. So this is the linked open data cloud in the background of all the linked open data. I'm just going to give a very brief overview of it. One of the things that's key about it that I think addresses some of the problems with interoperability in the humanities is that it does allow resources to sort of maintain their silos, if you like. If you think of those as silos from the top. Those are discrete research collections, but they're linked to each other through a set of technologies. And these technologies are designated by acronyms. And I'm just going to work through how they work together very briefly. The concept is very simple. It's basically a grammatical structure, a subject, a predicate, and an object. And these together make up what are called triples. Now at the bottom there's a very simplified representation of what RDF looks like. It looks a lot worse than that, trust me. But these are all triples. These are all statements about particular people. And I've made a mistake here. I have updated this to say Pauline Johnson here, but this should say Pauline Johnson here as well. So pretend these are all statements about Pauline Johnson. And once you bring them together with ontologies, you have these little statements that talk about entities, subjects and objects, predicates, verbs that bring them together, relationships. And then you have an ontology that tells you something about how these things are related to each other. How are classes of objects related to predicates? And once you have that, then you can get to inferences or queries that are able to pull out of this data between this and this something more than was there explicitly, right? So you're able to infer something that was not explicit before, or answer a question that was not explicitly stated in your data set. So the promise of linked data is that it will allow us to take little bits of information from here, there, and everywhere, from all these silos, and bring them together into something that is greater than the sum of its parts. Something that allows us to aggregate that information and learn from it more than we would if it stayed separate. And this is a very simplistic view of what it might look like, but this is an implementation of linked data through Google. And what you can see is that it's much more organized than our standard search results on the left, right? So they've been able to use categories of objects associated with Pauline Johnson, types of information associated with Pauline Johnson, and give us a more organized and unified view of this. So one of the things that's important about these info boxes, these knowledge boxes that Google's providing for us, is that they're not drawing on humanities scholarship. They're drawing on commercial providers of information. They're not even drawing on libraries. Libraries are working hard to get their information into these types of results. But we're not there yet. So a major thing is happening in our knowledge environment, and We could be players there, but we are not. And I would argue, based on information theorists like Jeffrey Bowker and Susan Lee Starr, that it's absolutely crucial that we do. Because how we categorize the world, how we draw up our ontologies, how we relate things to one another makes a big difference in how our world gets constructed. So Bowker and Starr, if you don't know this book, especially if you're in a field like library and information science, or you're working with metadata or markup, it's a brilliant exposition of the ways in which classification constructs our world, changes our world. So, the stakes are high about how this kind of knowledge is organized and accessed. Linked open data offers the opportunity to contribute to large collaborative knowledge production. And if you look at this list of cyber infrastructure elements associated with linked open data, you can see that many of them are really collaborative in nature, right? We would have to decide how to work together to do this. It couldn't just be done by one person or by an organization. It would have to be done by a large community. So there's a kind of necessity for collaboration, a necessarily collaborative element involved in putting materials together, even though they would be able to live in their sort of separate places. It would be about bringing them together, and that is indeed the point of linked open data. It's a vision of a worldwide collaboration in the production of interoperable data that would make the World Wide Web pale by comparison in terms of its searchability, its ability to be processed, and its ability to support advanced affordances such as inference, such as serendipity. But, with a few exceptions, there's little work in the humanities involving content that's really leveraging linked open data as linked data. There are some projects, and here I really am speaking from a North American context. I do know that semantic web technologies have been adopted much more widely in the EU, so I'm really looking forward to hearing about any projects you might tell me about that are exceptions to this. But certainly what I know about in Europe are large-scale library projects, Europeana in North America, linked data for libraries. I know about tool projects like most of these that are trying to give us the wherewithal to produce linked data, but I don't know of extensive humanities linked data sets that are really linked into the semantic web. The one that I know best is Pelagios, which is brilliant in terms of both working with content, starting with the content of the places of the ancient world, but now extending out to historical places more generally, mobilizing a community around that activity, and producing the tools for doing that. So I'm arguing that there is, in this context, a kind of major gap in collaboration in the humanities. Undoubtedly, it's very hard, but I think the extent to which we sidestep this obvious area of collaboration and keep on working in our siloed projects, big and small, speaks of a form of repression that goes maybe beyond difficulty in a simple sense. So I want to talk here about both the spectrum of collaboration, the range, the virtual rainbow of possibility, and the specter of collaboration, the scariness of it, which I think is in some ways repressed but lurking beneath some of the choices that we're making as a community. So I'm overplaying it slightly because of the pun on specter and spectrum, but I do want to suggest that collaboration may be more of a challenge than we've recognized, that it has at base a kind of threatening quality related to alterity, to boundary crossing, and threats to the self. And I'm a scholar of Victorian literature, so I'm really interested in the way that literature connected to the rise of certain kinds of technologies in the period. And what we see very often is that, starting with the slightly pre-Victorian Frankenstein, going right up to the end of the century with things like Dracula, Jekyll and Hyde, Rudyard Kipling's story Wireless, is that there's a very strong association between new technologies and the uncanny, or the ghastly, or the paranormal. In coming to terms with new modes of information storage, transmission, retrieval, and use, we're confronted with something other, something different that's clearly cognitive. It thinks, but it doesn't think like us. It unsettles and destabilizes, and it threatens our familiarized understanding of what it is to think and know. And that's why I think we have cyborgs and vampires and ghosts circulating around these sorts of developments, and we have them in our own period too, right, in our own popular culture, in the way we think about technological developments. So although I led with technological aspects of collaboration, what I really want to focus on here is the major challenges to collaboration at scale that are social rather than technological. So I've taken a stab here at mapping them out in terms of 3 overlapping domains of social factors impacting collaboration within the digital humanities: intellectual cultures, institutional contexts, and embodied identities. And I'm going to talk about some of these things in more detail than others. First, intellectual culture is a huge factor. The question of interdisciplinarity looms big here. Many projects involve collaboration because of the need to bring in different types of expertise, but there's a big debate over whether or not one needs to code, over the extent to which a single investigator with decent knowledge of 2 areas does as well as or better than somebody who, than a project that combines 2 or more experts working together. So Scott Weingart, Lisa Spiro, Ted Underwood, Lynn Siemens have all looked at what it means for people to sort of collaborate across domains and across areas of expertise. But collaborating with someone from a different discipline or even the same discipline in a different intellectual community, say from a different intellectual, say from a different continent, right? That even the same disciplines operate quite differently on different sides of the Atlantic, poses major challenges. There are challenges to language, specialist discourses, different methodologies, different stakes, different outputs. A computer scientist may not care about a book one bit, but really need papers at particular conferences. And interdisciplinarity, getting the kind of symbiosis of working across disciplines, is very hard to do. Peter Gallison has written about the conditions of inequality in the exchange between people in different disciplines, particularly if they're not of the same rank, and if one is technical and one is non-technical. Elizabeth used the term transdisciplinarity this morning, and I think that's a very good word because I think interdisciplinarity, true interdisciplinarity, is actually very hard to achieve in a range of ways. But at the very least, if we're working with people from outside our own areas of expertise, we need to become literate, to read to a level of basic comprehension of the other intellectual field. One of the things that can be really useful in working across fields is charters, project charters or agreements that help to manage expectations, to set an understanding and provide a means of addressing a conflict. Institutional context, there's lots in scholarly literature here. Bethany Novisky has written a lot about, along with others, about the alt-ac movement, about people who are in non-professorial positions who play key roles in DH projects. There's a lot of boundary work that circulates around institutional context. Confusion and ambiguity of roles or of status can really lead to difficulty. And more recently, too, we've had the challenges of how do we bridge beyond the academy? How do we engage citizens and community groups in our work? And what are the ethics of doing that? And I think people like Moya Bailey have written really powerfully on what it is that we need to do when we're engaging with a community. People working in North America with First Nations groups are also doing a lot of hard work around what it means to engage with the knowledge of another community and what are the ethics involved in that. Credit is a major issue that comes up again and again, both when we're talking about how people are paid for their work and also how that work is acknowledged intellectually. And there's been quite a bit of work done by scholarly societies to try to make sense of how credit should work within the digital humanities. Within Quirk, we're working on a prototype that takes those stamps, those workflow stamps that I was mentioning, and leverages them to try to indicate how you might give credit for something that is not just written by one person. And so on the left, we have a visualization of a document within Orlando that was written by several people, one document, and you can see a couple of people did a great deal of the work on it, and other people just a little bit. And then this is one research assistant's contributions to all of the Orlando project. So she did a lot of work on 4 documents and then did a lot of little edits. This is probably source checking, where you don't change the document very much, but you do really important work. So trying to visualize that kind of activity is one way of trying to manage the fear that gets involved when people are investing their time in a collaborative project and they don't understand how they'll be recognized, how that work will be credited. So it's a way of trying to build accountability into the system, but that accountability can also raise problems in other ways. The possibility of people gaming the system in certain ways and trying to manipulate it in order to get more credit than they deserved. It also exposes laziness, which can be a political issue in a project, right? If you can produce comparative visualizations, and so one colleague of mine put it that, what if the RAs basically build the car and the principal investigator is the one who just shines it up, right? The principal investigator might not be too comfortable having that process exposed. So there are politics to this, and there's certainly institutional politics as well, in that something like this would only be effective if it could be institutionally recognized in some way and taken on board within an institutional context. So both institutional and intellectual factors combine with the third one of embodiment into the messiness of the social work of born digital scholarly collaboration. We heard last week, those of us who were at Krakow for the Digital Humanities 2016 conference, Agnieszka Zaluska, the head of CERN, on why she thought CERN had been so successful. And she said it was because of close collaboration within CERN between research institutions, between universities and leading institutional firms, and particularly the diversity of the people who work at CERN as being a source of innovation. And I know because when the DH conference was in Lausanne a couple of years ago, I went for a tour of CERN, which is like a little university, that they welcome not just intellectual and institutional diversity, but also embodied diversity, diversities of identity, because I saw quite a number of queer CERN stickers on doors and so on with the rainbow that made it clear that this was a truly diverse, vibrant community that valued difference in all of its forms. Because collaboration doesn't stop at the intellectual or the organizational, it goes to the heart of embodied experience. This means radically confronting difference, both differences of identities and differences in the construction of reality, in meaning making, and with it, conflict and the possibility of change. So my question is, how can we foster that engagement with otherness? And I want to talk just briefly about 3 initiatives that I think go some distance towards showing us the way that we might go. The first is ARC, run by Laura Mandel out of Texas A&M University. It's an aggregator of digital resources. It doesn't mess with what those resources are doing. It simply gathers metadata from them, lightweight RDF, so linked data, and makes that a gateway into searching across all of those resources together. And they've also developed this visualization tool for allowing people to visualize all of the collections within ARC. So it takes scholarly groups and it empowers them to decide what's important about their field. It lets them bring them all together, and it gives them a place to access them and to explore them without trying to run those particular disciplinary bodies. One of the things that I think is exemplary about ARC is that they're not just staying still. It's actually a project that goes back quite some distance and was started in the early 2000s, I would guess, by Jerome McGann, maybe even the late 90s, by Jerome McGann with a grant that he was given by the MacArthur Foundation. And they've grown to the point where the governance structure no longer works and where the metadata is showing strains, because they started with they started with 19th century scholarship, and now they've got not just textual oriented stuff, but they've got music coming in, and they've got a lot of more visual materials as well. So the whole metadata model is broken in a sense. And so they're just redoing it all. And they are also redoing their governance structure, because they essentially had a kind of two-tier system of the founding fathers or the founding nodes, and then the little nodes that didn't really have such an important place. And they're also redoing that. So I think it's a really good example of how confronted with difference and the conflict that was starting to arise from difference, that organization was agile enough to be able to rethink itself and change. Another is Honey. This is an Australian project, the Humanities Networked Infrastructure. And it's also an aggregation project. They aggregated metadata from a number of libraries and research projects. And what it allows you to do is take that metadata and build relationships between entities. So you're doing the predicate work of linked data, coming up with those verbs that connect entities. But instead of giving you a fixed ontology, Honey lets you choose your predicates and puts them in conversation with other predicates. So they call this vernacular ontology building. And it's about the negotiation of difference. It's recognizing diverse perspectives on knowledge and amplifying avenues for research discovery beyond things like keyword searching and phrase searching, and making, again, the consumer of knowledge into a producer of knowledge. The third one that I'll talk about briefly is FemTechNet. This is, in some ways, the broadest and most open of the three. It's a collaborative network that operates in a range of ways. It's academic, it is a very powerful social media presence, it's pedagogical, it runs these courses called distributed open collaborative courses, which are an alternative to MOOCs, the massive online courses that we all know about. It's also activist in that it takes very pronounced stances on things and works to change them. So for instance, it takes on problems that span the academic and the non-academic world in things like online violence, like rape threats, doxing, and so on. They've got a grant to sort of put together a kit to sort of provide ways of resisting that kind of online behavior and dealing with it if you are subject to it. They're pushing out new models of pedagogy. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about all three of these, but particularly about FemTechNet or about Haystack, some of you may have heard about Haystack, which is the Humanities, Arts, Science, and Technology Collaboratory out of the States also, is that they're meta-institutional. They're not associated with any particular university. And that means that they operate outside of some of those constraints that I was talking about around institutions. So all of these projects are negotiating difference to draw on understandings of knowledge as situated. And I'm thinking here of the work of John Seeley Brown and Paul Duguid in The Social Life of Information, quite an old book now, but very important, I think, to understanding the ways that technology gets adopted or not. Also the work of people like Lucy Suchman and Anne Balsamo. And if you're interested in the whole question of the relationship between diversity and standards, I think these are very good projects to look at because they're really working at the rock face of those challenges of how we recognize difference and diversity, but also realize that in order for things to work together, we have to standardize in certain kinds of ways. So where have we got with collaboration at this point? I think we've got a sense that it's quotidian, but complicated. It's kind of banal, but it's part of everyday experience, which has intellectual impacts in a whole range of ways. It is potentially transformative, and what I want to argue is that these projects give us a sense of how we might get from the specter of collaboration to a kind of rich spectrum that would enrich the ways in which we do our work. Characteristics of my three examples are that they are open, they are outward facing, and they are attentive to difference and diversity. So my suggestion is that to really realize the potential for collaboration in the digital humanities, we need openness to the hard stuff and a commitment to diversity in many forms. The possibility is that we can shift not only our scholarly practices, but impact our culture and its relationship to technology. And I'm sorry, I didn't know how to translate the title there, so I don't have a French title. But the basic idea is that I think by being collaboratively alive to the challenges and the ways in which they affect us as embodied people situated in particular institutional, intellectual, and personal contexts, that we have the possibility to unleash a different and deeper form of collaboration that will really transform digital humanities, but also have the possibility to push out into the world to become part of that larger information environment and make a difference there too. So that's the vision. I thank you very much for listening to me today, and I look forward to the conversation.